Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I realize we've got well over 800 people joining us, which is fantastic. So welcome to Restoring Coral Reefs, Guidelines, Best Practice, and Success Stories. We're here today to kick off the UN Decade on Ocean Restoration through the International Coral Reef Initiative, focusing on coral restoration. I am Jennifer Koss, Director of NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program. Our conservation program here in NOAA is supporting effective management of sound science to preserve, sustain, and restore valuable coral reef ecosystem for future generations. We are a matrix program bringing to bear NOAA's multiple capabilities in coral conservation, including providing coral bleaching forecasts, conducting the National Coral Reef Monitoring Program, and assisting in capacity development in the many areas of U.S. coral reefs to ensure our partners have the best available science to conserve their coral reefs. I'm delighted to be your moderator, and looks like we are fully together here today and ready to kick events off. So I'm very pleased to announce Ambassador Peter Thompson will be our first speaker. In 2017, the UN Secretary General Guterres appointed Ambassador Peter Thompson of Fiji as his special envoy for the ocean, aiming to galvanize concerted efforts to follow up on the outcomes of the 2017 UN Ocean Conference, maintain the momentum for action to conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Take it away, Ambassador Thompson.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all courtesies observed, and greetings to everyone present. During this very welcome event, we're going to hear many positive reports on what is being done to restore coral reefs around the world. So I'd like to start my remarks by applauding all those involved. The next thing I'd like to do is ring the alarm bells. You've heard them already, but it's my job to keep ringing them. The ocean is the great regulator of climate through the water cycle, through oceanic circulation, and the ocean's biological pump. It absorbs around 23% of our annual emissions of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It has also absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat caused by anthropogenic greenhouse gases, with the top few meters of the ocean storing as much heat as the planet's entire atmosphere. It is provocative to appreciate that the constancy of these contributions and capacities have their limits. Over 80% of the ocean experienced at least one marine heat wave in 2020, and ocean warming is now being observed at depths of 1,000 meters. Many thresholds and tipping points are becoming apparent, with concurrent negative impacts on marine biodiversity and ecosystem services. We know that due to excess CO2 emissions, the ocean is acidifying at the fastest rate in the history of the planet. It'll be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for many ocean ecosystems and species to adapt to such rapid change. Coupled with ocean warming, this escalating acidification is bringing the very survival of coral reefs into question. The IPCC has reported that up to 90% of tropical reefs will disappear even if global warming is constrained to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is deeply concerning at a time when the WMO reports we are currently on a path to over 3 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. Coming from an island that is ringed by a mighty coral reef, it's incomprehensible to me that the coral will no longer be there. Rather like being told if you live in the middle of a prairie that there will be no longer any grass. We must refuse that future. Along with the myriad of benefits that coral provides us and nature as a whole, marine ecosystems such as mangroves, seagrass meadows, and salt marshes are, in terms of area covered, 10 times more effective at sequestering carbon dioxide than terrestrial forests. In spite of their massive sequestration benefits to us, human activity is destroying these coastal habitats at an alarming rate. So the protection of these blue carbon assets must be top of mind for both climate and ocean action. What the ocean gives, it can take away, and with this in mind, we must bring preservation and restoration of the ocean's blue carbon assets to the fore at COP26. COP26 also presents the best opportunity for the world to move the climate finance needle decisively in the direction of strengthening the ocean's contribution to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Moving this needle and bringing ocean issues to the center of UNFCCC deliberations will create much greater impetus for countries to include and operationalize ocean-related measures in their climate strategies, including building resilience for coastal ecosystems. An exponential increase in the share of climate finance going in the direction of the sustainable blue economy over the next decade will greatly accelerate our advance to a net zero carbon world by 2050. This is made clear in the published reports of the High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy, written by over 250 experts from around the world under the leadership of 14 serving heads of government. Ladies and gentlemen, biodiversity is critical to the implementation of climate crisis solutions. Reducing carbon emissions is essential, but we still need to draw down the excess carbon in the atmosphere and the ocean. The best way of doing that is through nature. But as things stand, there isn't enough wild nature left to do the job. The science is clear. We need to protect and rewild a large portion of the planet, and that includes protecting and restoring coral reefs, mangroves, seagrass meadows, and kelp forests. The positive mitigation and adaptation contributions marine protected areas bring to the climate crisis is well established, giving further impetus to nature-based solutions being at the top table of consideration and funding at COP26 in Glasgow in November. On coral's behalf, I will close my remarks by underlining that better safeguarding of coastal and marine health calls for greater efforts to minimize the negative effects of land-based human activities, in particular through source-to-sea discharges and emissions. The IPCC report on the ocean and cryosphere specifically highlights fragmented governance systems as a key challenge to addressing climate change risks, and adopting a source-to-sea approach ameliorates this fragmentation. Plastic waste, industrial effluents, excess nutrients from agriculture, fertilizer and pesticide runoffs, and sewage carried to the sea and rivers and drainage systems degrade coastal ecosystems, further compromising the ocean's climate services. So endorsement by us all of the source-to-sea ethos would represent a significant boost for improvements in the ocean climate nexus and the well-being of long-suffering coastal ecosystems. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Thompson. Next up is not only the Honorable Patricia Scotland, Queen's Counsel, but the Right Honorable Patricia Scotland, Queen's Counsel. Patricia Scotland is Secretary General of the Commonwealth. She was born in the Commonwealth of Dominica. Her career has been marked by achieving a number of extraordinary firsts, not the least of which was to be named first woman in the more than 700-year history of the office to serve as Her Majesty's Attorney General for England and Wales and for Northern Ireland. While holding these and other senior ministerial office positions, she was given responsibility, among other things, for gender equality, domestic violence, forced marriage, international child abduction, and from these positions promoted diversity and equality of opportunity, particularly for women and girls. As the only woman to have been appointed Secretary General of Commonwealth, she's placing special emphasis on mobilizing the 54 nations of the Commonwealth to tackle climate change, including its disproportionate impact on women, and through women's enterprise to build the resilience of smaller or more vulnerable countries. We're so pleased to have you.
Thank you very much indeed. So can I say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends. It's a great privilege and a pleasure to be asked to follow Ambassador Peter Thompson to address you on this critical time in our history when Commonwealth and indeed global solidarity is so needed if we are to address the climate crisis, which we now all face. The Commonwealth, as you all know, represents 54 countries from across 5 regions of the world. That's 2.5 billion people, 60% of whom are under the age of 30. And so we are the first generation to truly suffer the adverse consequences, this crisis, but the last to be able to do something about it. So time is of the essence, but so is what we together choose to do in response. The launch of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration will make a pivotal contribution to achieving our ambition for a sustainable planet. Coral reefs provide a home to about 25% of all marine species and at the most diverse of all the planet's ecosystems, rivaling the diversity found in the Amazon forest. Some 250 million people, many in small island developing states, or as we like to call them, large blue ocean states, and the developing coastal countries depend directly on coral reefs for food and income, making them particularly vulnerable to their loss. And coral reefs also provide vital protection to low-lying communities at risk from coastal flooding. And as you know, the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius states that coral reefs would decline by 70 to 90% with global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, whereas virtually all, that's 99%, would be lost with a 2 degrees Celsius warming. So warming seas and ocean acidification are widely recognized as key threats to the long-term survival of coral reefs. So you won't be surprised that I endorse everything Ambassador Thompson has said about those issues to date. Now, urgent action is needed to protect these vibrant habitats from the effects of climate change, pollution, overfishing, and other problems caused by people, such as coral mining and poor tourism practice. A total of 37 out of the 54 Commonwealth member countries have coral reefs, accounting for 45% of the global whole by area. So of the 20 countries with the largest coral reef area, 10 are within the Commonwealth. So experts say the decline of these precious underwater ecosystems can be prevented, and it might be possible to regenerate them as long as the commitment to do so starts now, to ensure that they can be enjoyed by future generations. And ocean issues cannot be solved alone. We must join forces in common purpose while taking an approach that respects our principles and values. And 3 years ago, recognizing the increasing urgency of ocean issues, Commonwealth heads of government adopted the Commonwealth Blue Charter. What that charter has done in those 3 years, I think, is frankly remarkable, because it's different from other multilateral environmental agreements in that it focuses on how countries will organize to meet existing national and international commitments, such as SDG 14, and focuses on implementation. To date, 15 countries have stepped forward to lead or co-lead. We've got 10 action groups reflecting their most pressing priorities. And the action groups cover topics such as coral reef protection and restoration, blue economy, coastal fisheries, and so forth. 46 of the Commonwealth 54 countries have already joined one or more of these 10 action groups. Australia, Belize, and Mauritius are co-championing the action group to protect and restore coral reefs, together with like-minded members. And I'm extremely proud that the Commonwealth countries are leading this sterling effort. The action group focuses on the protection and restoration of coral reefs by promoting policies and techniques that confer reef resilience, and by developing and implementing coral reef restoration methods that can be applied at scale and engage community participation. And the action group is also pursuing synergies with the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network and the International Coral Reef Initiative. And some of the key challenges that we all need to address are the issues faced by coral reefs. And you're so familiar to them, but I feel I have to just set them out, because we've got the governance barriers which are affecting the ability to work effectively to address issues that are cross sectorial boundaries, political boundaries, and require connection between land-based activities and ocean affairs, and across governance levels. And I hope many of you will be looking at the work we're doing on the call for living lands, because we have to triangulate what are we doing on the ocean, what we're doing on atmosphere, and what we're doing on land. Then there are the financial barriers. The funds that are needed to address the threats are known to exceed the funds available. Then what about the scale? Because we're being able to replicate and scale conservation and restoration activities is critical to achieving international policy commitments. And the barriers to decision making, they continue to be challenges in achieving sufficient relevant information to inform decisions in a timely manner. So these governance challenges could be addressed more holistically, including through a robust policy gap analysis to understand how local, regional, national, and international policies pertaining to coral reef restoration and protection intersect. So coral reef restoration is not a replacement for reducing local, regional, and global stresses acting on reefs, such as climate change, marine pollution, and overfishing. But the protection and effective management of intact reefs are prerequisites to successful risk-informed restoration. So when taking action, it is important to be able to monitor change and understand whether the action taken is having the desired effect. So understanding what works and what doesn't work is critically important if we are to get where we need to be. There continue to be challenges in the regular and comprehensive monitoring of coral reefs and the ability to make up-to-date data accessible and useful, development of indicators that are sufficient in the information they can give, and the time frame in which they can inform management decisions. Our Blue Charter partners at the Allen Coral Atlas are addressing these challenges with daily monitoring of coral reefs globally, using satellite data and AI approaches to detect bleaching events. And these innovations are providing the opportunity to overcome monitoring gaps with products that are being made freely available to all countries. In order to protect these vital ecosystems, we need to continue building partnerships and strategies for on-the-ground action to conserve coral reefs. This is the decade of ecosystem restoration. There is a need for us all to collectively join forces, share knowledge and learn lessons to protect and restore our global coral reefs. The Commonwealth stands ready and welcomes partners to join us on this journey to protect and restore coral reef ecosystems to the betterment of the ocean and humanity. I believe together, if we choose, we can do this. So let's go.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you here today. We will move on into the bulk of the event here, into our keynote on coral restoration. With Dr. Margot Hein, who is a consultant to the International Coral Reef Initiative. Margot is also a marine ecologist and lead consultant at Marine Ecosystem Restoration Research and Consulting. She specializes in coral reef restoration and linking theory to practice, and she has been wonderful in keeping ICRI on track in terms of the multiple publications we have coming out, and has been a pleasure to work with for many years now. Take it away, Margot.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for the introduction, and to the ambassador and the secretary for such moving words to start off this event. I would also like to give a special thanks to both Francis and Thomas for putting this event together, which is extremely exciting. My name is Margot, and I'm a consultant. I work specifically with ICRI and the UNEP, And I have the great honor today to give this special keynote address in which I will introduce coral reef restoration on the eve of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Now, standing on the shoulders of giants, really, and with the incredible excitement that is associated with the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, but also that of the UN Decade on Ocean Science, I think it's incredibly important that we all acknowledge that the time for action for coral reef is now. Yes, of course, reducing carbon emissions and mitigating the impacts of climate change should still be an absolute priority. But if we don't do anything, even under low emission scenarios, coral reefs as we know them and the myriad of services that they provide are still likely to be one of the first ecosystems to vanish because of climate change. And in the words of Carlos Duarte and his colleague, who published a wonderful piece in Nature last year, rebuilding marine life is a grand challenge for humanity, an ethical obligation, and a smart economic objective to build a sustainable future. But time is also of the essence. So the science, the expertise, the funding for coral reef restoration are lagging behind that of other ecosystems, particularly terrestrial systems. So in the field of coral restoration, we're still playing catch-ups with the grand challenge of not reinventing the wheel and applying lessons learned from decades of practice in other systems, but also trying to find solutions specifically for coral reefs. And these require a great deal of innovation. Earlier this year, there was a really interesting paper published in Global Change Biology entitled The 10 Golden Rules for Reforestation. Now, that paper was specifically to terrestrial system, but I thought that going through some of those rules today will help illustrate the grand challenge and the road ahead for coral reef restoration. I won't be able to go through all the rules today, don't worry, but instead I'll go through a select few, starting with rule number 1, which is to protect existing forests first. And that is on the basis that the natural loss of natural forests cannot be easily or really ever compensated by reforestation. Here, of course, we want to talk about protecting existing coral reefs first. And that rule is loaded with a variety of very important messages. The first message is that coral restoration should never be used as an excuse for degradation. We have already lost too many reefs. Rule number 2 is that it should never be considered as a short-term fix. Corals are extremely slow-growing animals, and the processes of reef recovery after a disturbance are still poorly understood. And we definitely need to view coral reef restoration as a long-term reef management strategy. And rule number 3 is that restoration should not be seen as a standalone strategy, nor should it be seen as the first point of action after a disturbance. Instead, it should be integrated and seen as the last part of a continuum of actions. Those actions including reducing impact first and then improving reef ecosystem management. Rule number 2 is to select appropriate areas for restoration. And this rule works for both forests and corals alike and is actually key to framing the role of restoration in ecosystems. It's key because the location of a restoration sites need to be carefully selected for specific goals. Now, those goals may include increasing fisheries productivity, improving or creating new tourism opportunities, as well as restoring the structure and the function of a degraded coral reef. The location of a restoration site is critical to maximize efficiency and efficacy, and that for several reasons. First, we need to make sure that the proposed sites for restoration is not going to lead to conflicts over reef resources among different types of stakeholders. We want to make sure that this site is not likely to be impacted by current or future disturbances. And we also want to make sure that where the restoration is going to be located means that we can integrate the restoration effort with other management strategies. For example, putting the restoration area within an already existing marine protected area. And third, the location of the restoration area may provide opportunities for scaling up. Where the restoration effort is located matters. We may be able to use mixed method strategies if the restoration site is close enough to underwater and land-based nurseries. We may be able to connect the restoration effort with other small-scale efforts to increase the overall ecological footprint and scale of the restoration effort. Rule number 3 is to use resilient plant material, well, in our case, resilient coral material. It is very important to realize that climate change is not going away, and reef restoration needs to think of what the reefs of the future will look like. For this, we need to make sure that we maximize genetic diversity and functional redundancy. This can be done by including methods such as larval-based restoration and also increasing the number of species that are being used for restoration around the globe. We need to harness natural adaptation processes. It's very important to realize that not all coral species are equal in the face of climate change. Now, if we can use those species that are naturally more resistant to current conditions, we're likely to improve the success of coral restoration in the long term. And third, we need to incorporate research on adaptation mechanisms. Yes, the coral animal is extremely fragile and it's already living at the very upper limits of its thermal tolerance in many places in the world already. But there are lots of current research ongoing on how to boost the animal's capacity to resist and maybe even recover better from projectic disturbances. Now, if we can make sure that we invest in the appropriate research, that we test all the potential alternatives, and if we can properly implement those cutting edge research on the field, then we might have a future for both reefs and coral reef restoration. Finally, rule number 4 is to work together. This is a very broad rules, but includes very important messages. First, that we need to include local stakeholders and that at all stages of a restoration efforts. This is incredibly important to make sure that we maximize the delivery of social and ecological benefits to the local community, that we improve local capacity and stewardship, avoid ecological imperialism, as well as integrate local knowledge in the design, implementation, and monitoring of efforts. Second, working together also means to work across disciplines. If we're going to be successful in scaling up restoration efforts, we need to think beyond the academic box of marine biologists and harness the mind of other groups such as economists, modelers, engineers, social and political scientists alike. And finally, of course, improving the scope, scale, and impact of restoration means that we need extensive communication and collaboration. Now, there's an incredible energy already going on towards that goal with the leadership of ICRI, for example, its partners, its members, and its ad hoc committee on coral reef restoration, the leadership from the Commonwealth Blue Charters and its action group on reef restoration and protection specifically, the UN Environmental Programme, the World Economic Forum and its exciting Uplink Innovation Challenge, the Coral Restoration Consortium, the Reef Resilience Network, as well as some other national initiatives such as the NOAA Coral Reef Conservation Program in the US, ICRI in France, or the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program in Australia. And these are only just a few examples of all the amazing work that's going on behind the scene of coral restoration at the moment. All of these groups are working tirelessly to put together guidelines, best practices, and success stories. Some of these will be shared later today. There has never been a more urgent time to restore coral reefs, and I, for one, definitely look forward to the challenge of being part of this amazing journey as we enter the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margot. Next up is Dr. Ian McLeod of Tropwater. Ian is a multidisciplinary research leader at James Cook University with a passion for science communication, innovation, and applied research. He has 20 years broad experience working in environmental research, management, and communication on every continent. In 2019, he was seconded to the Australia Institute of Marine Science to help lead the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program.
Thank you, Jennifer. So Margot finished her plenary talking about many people working tirelessly to produce best practice guidelines and reports. And so today I'm going to present a report that Margot led working tirelessly to get this out as the first report for the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So thanks very much for the introduction, Jennifer. So I'll get straight into the presentation. So it's my pleasure today to introduce a new report on coral restoration as a strategy to improve ecosystem services. This report was written in response to a resolution from the UN Environment Assembly in March 2019 that requested more guidance on the use of coral reef restoration to promote and sustain the delivery of ecosystem services. The timing of the report also coincides with the start of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And it was, as I mentioned, the first report to be released. It was put together by a team of experts as authors, but also an advisory committee, and most of who were part of the ICRI ad hoc committee for coral reef restoration. And I've had the pleasure to co-chair this committee since 2019, and it's great to see so many people from that committee presenting today. And this report was also our major output for 2020 for that committee. So the report was organized into 6 parts, and this allowed us to provide an overview of where the field of coral reef restoration is in terms of goals, methods used, and challenges. Secondly, we discussed the value of coral reef restoration in the context of climate change. And third, provide recommendations at different levels, more of an overview level for government, funding bodies, and general public, and more in-depth recommendations focus on goals and methods for managers and practitioners looking for guidance on how to implement projects more effectively. This report also presents 6 case studies highlighting best practice coral restoration efforts from around the world. And we'll hear from Tom Moore and Tadashi Kamara later in this to hear about 2 of those case studies. This report was also supported by a policy brief, which has been translated into 6 languages, and a short summary video. And so the report, the policy brief, and the summary video are all available on the ICRI's new restoration hub. So I encourage you to check that out. It's a real amazing source of information. In the first part of the report, we provided an updated definition of coral reef restoration, with that realization that the world's changed. Normally with restoration, you're thinking about historical reference sites and trying to make things how they were before. But we know with the changing world that the reality is we're going to need to focus more on structure, function, and ecosystem services and resilient reefs rather than historical reefs of the past. We also provide a list of goals, because coral restoration is not just about planting corals, but it's about securing those key ecosystem services across social and ecological scales. And finally, we present current and future methods showing the range of interventions available to assist reefs to move from degraded to healthy sites. So we split these different interventions into 3 main categories. One's around emergency restoration, for example, after extreme weather or ship groundings. Another section is current interventions, so some of the most commonly used interventions now, such as substrate addition and manipulation, direct transplantation, and coral gardening. And then also some of the interventions which are in an R&D phase. But I've got to say, even since the publication of this report earlier in the year, some of these interventions in the R&D phase are rapidly turning into interventions being used for management. And we'll also hear from the RAP Executive Director, Cedric Roublon, who'll talk more about some of these interventions as part of the Reef Restoration Adaptation Program. So there's a lot of research effort around the world into these new methods. So one of the key messages from the report is that coral reef restoration should be grounded in realism. So we've heard that from the opening remarks in the plenaries. When confronting climate change and its devastating impacts, we argue that's not an either-or situation. We really need to take action now, take strong and urgent action to mitigate climate change, also implement best practice current restoration methods, but also invest in coral restoration. But that reality is that coral restoration is not a quick fix. absolutely never an excuse for degradation, and it's a real risk. You could imagine a new hotel being built, blasting a channel through the coral in front of it, and then having a small coral restoration project and saying, isn't this fantastic? So we really want to avoid those sort of situations. And of course, it's not a solution on its own. However, what can coral restoration do now with our current methods? Well, it can really help protect genetic diversity, and that's going to give us the potential for coral reef species to adapt and change. Some of our coral reef species are endangered now, so working on those species allows us to prevent species extinction. It may help us with assisting species migration and continue the provision of key ecosystem services, for example, supporting tourism or fisheries. And also it really gives people a tangible opportunity for positive action. So you can really get involved and do something tangible. Overall, our recommendations in general were coral restoration can be useful to support resilience, especially at local scales. And we've talked about it not being a standalone short-term fix, but should be embedded within resilience-based management. Coral restoration is also not perfect. There's lots of challenges linked to how the novelty of the field and the sense of urgency. So it must be carefully planned with resilience and climate smart design in mind. And the next presentation by Dr. Liz Shaver will be talking about the new planning guide. Specific recommendations in the report are focused on goals and methods. These were based on an expert survey, so we drew from many of the presenters here again, and that's going to provide some information in this report about for readers, if they have a specific goal in mind for restoration, they can then refer to this table and see what the key things to consider are when you're designing your project. So for example, if your goal was to have a restoration project for climate adaptation and supporting goals, then you need to think that this will be at least 3 to 5 years, and we'll give specific recommendations. We also have tables here linking in your goals to the most appropriate methods. So overall, to conclude, our main conclusions from this report: to integrate restoration with threat and disturbance abatement strategies, to incorporate projections of climate change impacts and site vulnerabilities, and 3, consider prevalence of diseases, the physical integrity of reefs and connectivity of key species, and 4, definitely, we've thought about this as well, engage stakeholders and maximize social economic benefits for local communities so they can really get that buy-in and they'll care. And we've also heard today about the importance of monitoring so that we can really learn and have a great culture of sharing this journey and sharing our failures as well, because we also learn from those. We also came out with 2 policy recommendations in this report. Policy plans and funding specific to coral restoration are needed to assist implementation at local, regional and global scales. And coral reef restoration targets should be included in commitments as part of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all today, and please get in touch if you have any opportunities to chat or collaborate.
Thank you so much, Ian. We're going to move on to the Manager's Guide to Coral Reef Restoration Planning and Design, as well as the online restoration course and toolkit for capacity building of reef managers. Just a couple of words about the Manager's Guide. When NOAA was redoing its strategic plan, we knew that we needed to put a more comprehensive umbrella around our restoration activities and to really scale up the funding that we were providing for the states and territories in the US with coral reefs to be able to very strategically address restoration, especially in the Pacific, where it was just getting started. We had much more of a track record in South Florida and the Caribbean due to a lot of the devastation that had happened there over the past few decades. So it was incumbent upon us to make sure that we had a good, not only strategic plan, but then further guidance on how to approach restoration. And we were so pleased to be able to partner with the Nature Conservancy, as well as many other groups, including the US EPA and members of the US Coral Reef Task Force, to finish this document and actually get it into implementation. We were beta testing as we were writing. And so without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Elizabeth Shaver of the Nature Conservancy. Liz is a science lead lead for the Nature Conservancy's Reef Resilience Network. She's a coral reef ecologist with research focusing on coral reef restoration planning and design, the use of positive species interactions in restoration, and the effects of local management actions, such as a predator removal on the resilience of coral reefs to climate change. In her current role, she synthesizes and shares new coral reef science and develops training for coral reef managers and practitioners. Take it away, Liz.
Thanks so much, Jen, for that introduction. And thank you, Tom and Francis, for putting this event together. I'm very excited to have the opportunity today to be a part of this event and to share with you some of the work of my program, the Reef Resilience Network, on some resources that we are using to support the work of coral reef managers and practitioners around the world who are restoring our reefs. For those who don't know the Reef Resilience Network, we're a partnership between the Nature Conservancy and NOAA's Coral Program. Our mission is to support thriving and resilient coral reefs all over the world by working directly with managers and practitioners and helping build their capacity, really by acting as a bridge between them and the scientific community. Over the last 15 years or so, we've worked with managers and practitioners in over 2/3 of all of the countries and territories in the world with reefs. And we work with them to build their capacity by synthesizing and sharing the latest science and resources on coral reef conservation, by supporting their work to apply these new tools and concepts through things like trainings, online courses, webinars, and direct mentorship. And then we also try to connect them directly with experts and their peers to really help foster that exchange of knowledge and information. And part of our work is to connect with our network managers regularly and be discussing and assessing the needs that they have in terms of resources on a whole range of topics. And over the last 5 years or so, there's been a huge, really significant increase in interest in our managers in conducting restoration. And so we've been developing resources in that space and realized in doing that there was really this gap in resources and guidance out there, specifically on restoration planning. So with our partners from NOAA's Coral Program, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. All Coral Reef Islands Committee, and many others, we published in October 2020 a manager's guide to coral reef restoration planning and design. I'll just quickly summarize the process laid out in this guide. I don't want to go too much in detail, but just to give you a broad overview. So the guide is a 6-step process that considers climate change adaptation and is meant to be really flexible, meaning it can be tailored to people who are just starting restoration, as well as it can be used by those that already have a project or a program underway. What the guide does is it walks users through a series of these steps, the first 4 in particular that you see here in blue, and lead users to developing a restoration action plan. To do this, we provide a lot of background information and resources, as well as a suggested process for how they can conduct restoration planning in small teams, including a lot of consideration for stakeholder engagement. And we also provide a case study example. That's a real world case study that's carried out throughout all 4 of these steps to really help illustrate the process for users. Just a little detail on those 4 steps that lead to the restoration action plan. In step 1, users develop restoration goals and then consider a broad geographic area where they're going to focus their restoration efforts based on that goal. So in this step, we provide example general goals that are based on other recent published resources, one of them being the guide that Ian just presented on. And then we guide users to developing SMART goals, taking those general ones and then adding more specifics and making them really measurable and time-bound. In step 2, we guide users to identify, prioritize, and select sites where restoration will occur so that they meet their goal defined in step 1. In this step, we provide a framework for how sites can be evaluated, compared against each other, and then prioritized. We provide both a semi-quantitative and a fully quantitative example or approach for how to do this, as well as an Excel-based tutorial and example to help illustrate the process. And this table that you see on the slide is an example end product that you would have after going through this process. In step 3, we help users design and select their interventions. Specifically the methods that they're going to do based, again, on the goal they've defined. So in this process, we walk users through brainstorming all possible options for interventions, and then designing those interventions, thinking about some basic design considerations and also climate change specific considerations. And then we suggest a process for evaluating those different intervention options. We provide 5 criteria for doing this that you can see in this top diagram, things like effectiveness, feasibility, or urgency, and then a table that you can use. But again, this is really meant to be very adaptive, and we've seen users so far really adapt this part of the process for their needs. And then in step 4, users define their objectives, their activities, and timelines, and then they pull it all together into this restoration action plan. So in this step, we provide examples of objectives that are really meant to track shorter milestones of your restoration work that help you track that progress towards that end goal. And then those objectives can be used to define a set of activities and a time frame that need to be done to meet those objectives. Again, as these shorter milestones towards that goal. Along with the guide itself, we've developed several tools that can be used in tandem with the guide to help users in this process. The first one is the workbook. It's available as a separate Word document, but it really provides a place for you to document important information and decisions made during the planning process. It can be used as a reference document to support the restoration action plan, or used to support future efforts when the plan is being revised. Another tool that we've developed is the action plan template. It's also available as a separate Word document download. It provides a template for you to build an action plan, and it's designed to be populated directly from that workbook, so that the work you've done in the workbook is easily transferable as much as possible over to the action plan template. All of these resources are available on the NOAA Chorus website at the link at the top of this screen, but they're also available if you go to the ICRI Restoration Hub website. Of course, a guide like this is only meaningful if it's being applied to real-world situations, so I wanted to share a few examples of how we're doing that. Over the last 1.5 years or so, we've been working with the US Pacific jurisdictions of Hawaii, Guam, American Samoa, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. As Jen mentioned just before, we really beta tested the guide with these 4 jurisdictions as we were finishing the guide. So we were really able to learn a lot from this process, and then put it into the guide as well. We're also working with the Nature Conservancy's Africa program in Kenya and Tanzania to support local community groups to develop restoration plans. In Florida, the guide is about to be used starting this month, to support managers and practitioners in developing a coral reef restoration plan for the state. It will also be used to support the US Virgin Islands in restoration planning, and potentially Puerto Rico and Indonesia as well. Finally, I wanted to share just a few of our other restoration resources that we have available. Our website, reefresilience.org, has a toolkit of management strategies, and we have a whole section dedicated to restoration. This was put together with a host of partners from many restoration organizations, and it includes information on project planning, different methods for restoring coral populations and the physical reef substrate, information on emergency response restoration, and some broader landscape level considerations as well. And we also have our Coral Reef Restoration online course, which is open access and available to everyone on conservationtraining.org. This course includes 6 self-paced lessons with content, videos, interactions, and assessments. Lessons range from project planning to coral gardening and larval propagation. We have a lesson on restoring the reef structure for coastal resilience and rapid emergency response restoration, as well as lesson on monitoring specifically for restoration. Again, these are open access. They're available both in English and in Spanish, and we're working on updating them as new resources and guidelines come available. And with that, I want to thank you for your time today. Thanks again to the organizers of this event, and I wanted to also thank the UN for their focus on ecosystem restoration in this time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. Our agenda had a 10-minute discussion of these case studies and success stories. In the interest of time, we're going to move that discussion period to the very end of the event and move into some of the case studies here. The first one is on Coral Reef Protection and Restoration Action Group, actions throughout the Commonwealth. Vivian Ramnares of the Belize Fisheries Department is up next. And Vivian is a public servant within the government of Belize. For over 13 years, she served as a fisheries officer at the Belize Fisheries Department, mainly in their policy and planning unit. She's one of the main contacts for the country on the Commonwealth Blue Charter, and more specifically on the Coral Reef Protection and Restoration Action Group. Take it away, Vivian.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, okay. Okay, greetings from Belize. Due to the time, I won't be able to share a short video. I'll find some way how we can share that with the participants after this. But a part of the video mentioned that the action group, one of the key actions is to highlight successful case studies. And so I will present on 3 case studies throughout the Commonwealth. The first case study here, the first case study is on coral restoration efforts in the Laughing Bird Key National Park in Belize, one of 7 sites which make up the country's only World Heritage Site. Fragments of Hope, a nonprofit community-based organization, has focused on coral restoration since 2006. Over 20 years ago, due to Hurricane Iris and other factors, coral cover in the national park was reduced to 6%, especially for the species Acropora palmata. Fragments of Hope began restoration efforts through the transplantation of corals, mapping of acroporids during the warmest months, genetic analysis to ensure genetic diversity, and long-term monitoring for growth, survival rates, longevity, bleaching and disease response, and evidence of sexual reproduction. As you can see from the picture, coral cover has increased in the park. Results include over 82,000 corals outplanted in the park, increased coral cover from 6 to 50%, and a survival rate of 89% after 13 years. Other accomplishments include trainings and a manual targeting community members and actors to transfer knowledge of restoration, having 23 in situ coral nurseries in Belize, international recognition and knowledge exchanges in the Caribbean and Latin America. Challenges include long-term funding, climate change and weather impacts, costs of accurately quantifying restoration efforts compared to the actual restoration work itself. Key lessons learned include the involvement of local community and ownership of restoration work, which are important for success and sustainability. 2, the use of the same practitioners to build expertise. And 3, the impact of other success factors, such as the full protection of grazers since 2009, the establishment of no-take zones, and the outplanting outside of the hurricane season. This second slide on restoration shows that presently over 70 Belizeans have been trained, and there are 26 coral nurseries in 7 marine protected areas and other keys. Over 158,000 corals have been outplanted nationwide, and there is still work being done on 8 other non-aquapoid corals. Moving on to the second case study is on the Master Reef Guides program in Australia. It was launched in 2008, and the program builds capacity of tourism staff working on the Great Barrier Reef in Queensland. This case study demonstrates success in contributing to the management and conservation objectives of the Great Barrier Reef. These ambassadors can provide up-to-date information on the reef, share stories on the World Heritage Area, and explain what visitors can do to make a difference. The program is delivered by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, the Association of Marine Park Tourism Operators, and Tourism and Events Queensland. It's the first program of its kind working on the issues of coral reef. Tourism is the largest employer in North Queensland, and in 2015, an audit of the high standard tourism operators showed inconsistency and inaccuracy in some of the information delivered, and also highlighted an opportunity to improve interpretation and raise the bar across the entire tourism industry. This Master Reef Guides program, which was launched 3 years after, provides specific training on coral reefs and the Great Barrier Reef. It includes a 10-module online course, in-field training, and training from experts such as leading scientists, public speaking specialists, and traditional owners. As described in the case study, 63 Master Reef Guides are trained from 4 cohorts. They are considered the best in their field in relation to reef interpretation, master storytelling, and experience delivery. Challenges include adapting the content of the program to evolve as knowledge improves, managing the increased demand from operators as the program gains traction, and lastly, ensuring the quality and knowledge of guides requires ongoing management, engagement, and training opportunities. Key lessons learned: 1, maintaining close network of best practices. 2, peer support and continuous learning and ongoing training to keep current. 3, it's an opportunity for females in a male-dominated industry. And lastly, working with traditional owners to help create links and reconcile conflict between the traditional custodians of the reef and the industry that depends on it. The last case study is on the Bali Reef Rehabilitation Network. The network was launched in 2019 and is a coalition of non-governmental organizations, government representatives, academics, and marine tourism operators who are engaged in coral reef rehabilitation projects around Bali. The network was launched to discuss innovations, challenges, best practices, regulations, and other relevant topics, with a goal of sharing knowledge and information among people of diverse backgrounds and levels of experience regarding coral restoration. Bali's economy depends strongly on marine tourism, and the issues of climate change and the global decline of coral reefs has led to tourists looking for ways to do good on their vacations. Many of the restoration projects take advantage of this and involve tourists to get a hands-on experience. However, many of the projects have been executed without sufficient knowledge and planning. There's ecological, financial, and social factors that contribute to successful restoration. In addition, many projects are unfamiliar with local and national laws regarding restoration in Indonesia. Due to this, in 2019, the Coral Triangle Center convened a discussion forum as the first step toward the network for reef restoration around Bali. This case study indicates that the network has formed groups on WhatsApp with 21 members and a Facebook group of 45 members. Members share and discuss relevant news stories, coral restoration techniques, and events around Bali. The challenges include the lack of attention and time since the initial discussion forum, the language barriers between the locals and the expats, and the unclear and lack of policies related to restoration on local, regional, and national levels. Key lessons learned include inviting members to present on their own project to set a precedent that the group is inclusive, no matter the level of experience. So thank you, and you all can find the 3 case studies on the Commonwealth Blue Charter webpage, as well as other information on the Coral Protection and Restoration Action Group.
Thank you so much. Next, we are going to move over to a trial of coral reef restoration at a large spatial scale by Okinawa Prefectural Government in Japan. I think kicking off this talk will be Tadashi Kimura, who's with the Japan Wildlife Research Center. Tadashi is a chief researcher at the Japan Wildlife Research Center, where he directs Japan's national monitoring program of coral reefs, as well as a coordinator of the East Asia region on coral reef monitoring and conservation under ICRI's Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. Thank you for joining us today, Tadashi.
So can I start now?
Sure. I thought Tadashi was going to introduce you. I didn't realize that you were going to jump right in. So instead of Tadashi, this is Tomofumi Nagata, who's a researcher at the Okinawa Environment Science Center to carry out coral reef monitoring restoration around Okinawa and provides assistance to local entities, including coordination with concerned participants.
I appreciate your introduction, me. Hello, I am Nagata Tomofumi from the Okinawa Prefectural Environment Science Center, and Mr. Oshiro Kazuyuki is present next to me. It is a state of the coral reef in Okinawa, wonderful landscape. As in the world, Okinawa's coral reefs are generally in a state where they hardly recover from deterioration due to repeated disturbances, such as coastal development, inflow of soil and wastewater from land, outbreak of coral crown of thorns starfish, and mass bleaching by high water temperature. It has been going on for a long time. In Okinawa Prefecture, many measures are being promoted in a wide range of fields related to coral reef conservation. Among them, the Coral Reef Preservation and Rehabilitation Project and the Regional Model Project aim to restore coral reefs by outplanting coral colonies that promotes the recovery of coral communities more directly and more locally. The aim of both projects conducted in Okinawa Prefecture is to re-establish reef ecosystem function and mitigates population declines from climate change and enhance sustainable initiatives of local communities very carefully. The artificial restoration of coral communities, the conservation of coral reefs by outplanting have generally been pointed out as problems such as survival rate, cost, scale, diversity, and disturbance to the natural communities. At the same time, the importance of supporting local efforts has been raised. The project carried out from 2010 to 17 has demonstrated a series of procedures for coral community restoration by outplanting coral colonies. That is, in Onna village, coral farming began more than 20 years ago, and now more than 20,000 colonies are being farmed. The large-grown parent colonies are fragmented, settled on suitable base, and grown to suitable size. A large number of asexually produced seedlings are outplanted on coral reefs. The project also developed a technology for mass production of seedlings obtained by fertilizing coral eggs and sperm. After a series of demonstrations, the projects had established a certain scale of coral community restoration, suitable materials and methods by mass production of coral seedlings and outplanting that take into account natural environment, including biodiversity and genetic diversity, as a community-supported coral reef restoration project. The series of achievements was carried out primarily by fishermen in collaboration with the support of many citizens, businesses, governments, and research institutes, in particular, the coral aquaculture technology cultivated by the Onna Village Fisheries Cooperative since 1998, when the global mass bleaching was first reported, also contributed significantly. We included survival rate, reduced costs, outplanted to a few hectares, maintained diversity, and avoided disturbances. So have we cleared the problems? The mass bleaching in 1916th and 17th emerged another major issues, such as technical improvement for mitigation to mass bleaching, cost reduction, expansion to other areas, verification of the effects of outplanting of corals. These figures represent some of our efforts now. If technical improvements are made in the model area that can be evaluated and verified in conjunction with the establishment of a social system, efforts for coral reef restoration, including outplanting of corals, can be promoted on broad scale, thereby strengthening conservation efforts in other areas of Okinawa Prefecture. Achieving these goals is a major priority of the Okinawa Prefecture Coral Reef Preservation and Rehabilitation Regional Panel Project, as a community-suggested coral reef restoration. It is expected to spread from the model projects and the model areas to the other areas, as well as various efforts to protect coral reefs beyond coral farming and outplanting, communicating with the world. So far, we have introduced examples of Okinawa Prefecture projects. Thank you very much. Have a good World Environment Day in 2 days after tomorrow and the World Ocean Day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. We are moving into Tales from the Caribbean Coral Reef Restoration in Action with Dr. Anastasia Banishek from Corallium.
Oh.
And then we're just going to ask you to mute yourself, please. Anastasia is a research professor at the Reef Systems Academic Unit, a campus of the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, located in the Mexican Caribbean. Her research interests include coral photobiology, reproductive biology, and ecology, and specifically in research on best practices in larval-based restoration. Take it away, Anastasia.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction. Are you seeing my presentation okay? Yes, okay, perfect. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm speaking from the Mexican Caribbean. And I'd also like to thank everyone who made this event possible. Although only my name appears on the program, this presentation is designed to showcase key people and organizations who are working in restoration of coral reefs around the Caribbean. Here are some of the groups. These in particular answered my recent call to provide their most up-to-date information. Some of the organizations work locally, and others, such as SICO International and Iberostar, work in several countries. Some, such as Fragments of Hope in Belize, as you've already heard, have been restoring corals for way over a decade, whereas others, such as Icomares in Colombia and Raising Coral Costa Rica, are just getting started. All have the same guiding objective: to improve the status of coral reefs by restoring key reef building species and increasing coral cover. Approximately 600 million people depend directly on coral reefs, particularly through tourism. In the Caribbean, tourism amounts to approximately $356,000 per kilometer squared per year, and is the most important contributor to many local economies. It is also an important source of healthy proteins and food security for Caribbean countries, some of which fall into the low to lower middle income categories. Also, many Caribbean coral reefs are found close to the coastline, and as such are an important source of protection to it and to beaches against erosion. They also shield infrastructure from storm and hurricane damage by absorbing wave energy and dissipating it before it reaches the coast. This protection is so important that the Mexican government pays for an annual insurance policy to repair coral reefs in the Mexican Caribbean after damage from hurricanes. In fact, damage to the northern section of the Mesoamerican Reef after 2 major hurricanes that struck in 2020 is in the process of being repaired thanks to this insurance payout. However, Caribbean coral reefs are under threat from changes in land use. Pictured here on the left is the Cancun hotel zone before it was developed, and on the right, after 50 years, filled now with hotels. Farming on land and in the sea, as well as runoff, also affect coral reefs in certain parts of the Caribbean. Overfishing of key species, such as the queen conch shown here, with the conch meat filling the boat deck on one morning's fishing run in the 1970s. Climate change is driving increased sea surface temperatures, resulting in coral bleaching, and it is also driving ocean acidification. Contamination by nutrients is driving degradation in water quality, provoked by blooms of sargassum, as shown here, or by inadequate sewage treatment. Plastics are also found on all Caribbean beaches and even intertwined amongst coral, as shown here. Invasive species, such as the lionfish, originally from the Pacific, has seriously impacted populations of Caribbean fish. And diseases, such as the relatively recent stony coral tissue loss disease, or SCTLD, and previously white band disease, have both changed the landscape of coral reefs. All these factors have led to losses in coral cover amounting to 90% or even more for some coral species, leading to efforts to reverse the loss through restoration. Fortunately, in and around the Caribbean, there are many organizations working towards coral reef restoration, which is an efficient way to upscale efforts. Many villages working, sometimes together and sometimes independently, but all with the same objective to improve coral cover and promote biodiversity. This map is by no means complete, but it does give us an idea as to where restoration is happening, who is doing restoration, and more importantly, where there are gaps. Throughout the Caribbean, a wide variety of techniques is employed, ranging from fragmenting and using in situ nurseries and coral trees through to larval-based restoration, using in situ floating pools and land-based nurseries, as well as the adaptation of cryopreservation techniques to different life stages of corals and their inclusion in frozen repositories. One message is clear. In Latin American countries and territories bordering the Caribbean, restoration work is done on a larger scale, the projects last longer and are monitored for longer periods and at much lower costs, as published by Bayraktarov et al. Last year. This is when compared to the global average as published by Bayraktarov et al. In 2019. All of these have a similar feasibility or probability of success. However, for restoration to have a chance at succeeding, threats must be significantly reduced. On a global level, we need to slash carbon emissions. Regionally, water quality must be improved. And locally, land-based pollution must also be reduced. In the meantime, all these organizations are working in the Caribbean, scaling up efforts and producing corals to restore reefs for future generations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anastasia. Next up, we have Dr. David Vaughn of Plant a Million Corals Foundation. Dave Vaughn has held positions in aquaculture research and development for over 45 years. He directed the aquaculture division at Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution for 17 years and is the previous executive director of the MOTE Marine Laboratory in Florida Keys. He started the coral restoration program heralded with developing the new technology of microfragmentation. Dr. Vaughn is presently helping people globally in this process as a scalable tool for reef restoration and is the founder of Plant a Million Corals.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction and good morning from the Florida Keys, of which I am now a part of Plant a Million Corals. It's not just a great idea, it's also our mission, our vision, and the recipe to show that we can do this at scale. And you'll see the title of my talk is In Our Lifetime. And it has been shown that this is one of the most important things for coral reefs is to get on it soon and be able to do something where we can in just the next few years. As in many marine aquaculture programs, whether it's for growing fish or scallops or clams for food or for restoration, there's always been three phases to it: a hatchery phase, a nursery phase, which can be either land and or field, and a grow out phase that actually does the outplanting. However, in coral restoration, we jumped quickly to just the last section by using fragmentation of the fast growing branching corals. They were able to, in the field, just manually make large fragments by hand, produce them in large numbers, and outplant them. What we will have to do soon is to integrate all sections. And my colleagues from Japan, as well as Mexico, as previous speakers, were talking about the hatchery section. And that is vitally important for producing genetic diversity of species. But those numbers of hatchery produced organisms can be scaled up using asexual reproduction in a land-based or field-based nursery. Now, people did not start land-based nurseries for a while until recently because they thought the technology was too hard and too expensive. But that has definitely changed. From one of my mistakes in working in the lab a number of years ago of trying sexual reproduction was successful in producing a few dozen elkhorn corals. However, I was amazed that at 3 months old, you still had to take a picture through the microscope to show somebody what a newly recruited juvenile coral from sexual reproduction was. And on the right-hand picture, a picture of it at 6 months old, barely visible as the head of a pin. And it took 1 to 3 years to get to the size of a small coin. And at that time, I got disgruntled. That was too slow, moved it to another section, and mistakenly, by accident, broke it into small pieces, thinking that it would be stressed or hurt. Instead, it grew faster than ever before. So today we can see, like in this picture of palmata, one piece of palmata broken into 4 fragments. Each picture to the right is just 1 week old, ending in 11 weeks in the lower right of a piece that would have taken years to grow as they fuse back together from being the identical pieces. So we now take that technology to our advantage. It's now called microfragmentation, and it is a very different game changer for coral restoration. Instead of taking one coral the size of a golf ball, waiting 1 to 3 years till it grows a little bigger, we can actually cut it into 20 to 100 small fragments, and they will grow up, all of them, to the same size in just months instead of years. Here's shown by cutting them into small pieces. And this became a technique we used at MOTE Marine Lab to produce thousands of corals from microfragmentation from the massive species, which were not as easy to do as the field nurseries like the branching corals. In the Atlantic and the Caribbean, we have more of the massive species. So this allows us to use every species with the tools to be able to produce thousands at a time. And let's see how we get to 1 million and scale. One tank with 400 elkhorn corals, elkhorn can be cut into 50 pieces each, and you make 20,000 corals. So in just 6 months, those 20,000 corals have the capabilities of being cut again into 50 each and growing up to size in another 6 months and producing 1 million corals in as little as 1 year. This is how we get to scale. A tank with very small pieces of microfragments within just a few months fill that tank and fill those plugs. The picture on the right is some corals which not only filled the tanks, overflowed the plug, touched each other, and instead of fighting, actually produced a fused corals because they came from the same clonal pieces. We can now use that technique in the field. We can take 20 clonal pieces of microfragments, plant them on a dead coral skeleton at the size of 1/4 of a meter. And in just 2 years, they will grow together and fuse back together. And the ones that I planted in 2014 through 2016 were now shown to be able to mature and to actually spawn, as was documented by Hannah Koch for the plantings that I did just a few years earlier. So we can do this at scale and size. We can take a coral the size of a small car and put hundreds of clonal pieces and have them grow together. We can take a coral that is 3 to 4 meters across, 800 years old, and plant enough corals to actually bring it back to life. And how do we get this technology transferred to other people? Well, for one is to take all of the engineering and guesswork out of making a coral land-based system and turn them into turnkey operations by designing all the filters, pumps, tanks, valves, and putting them together. We can put them into a shipping container and ship both the water treatment system and the corals, which arrive in one day, pumping water on day 2, and showing people how to grow corals on day 3. It's affordable, it's adaptable to almost all communities, and it is 1 fraction of the cost of what people see as a multi-million-dollar university or organizational lab. And it's transportable. We're now working on solar-powered ones to be off-grid. So this is possible. And this is one of the pictures that Vivian showed of the success story in Belize, which is now also using microfragmentation in the field. They can go from something like you see on the left-hand picture to now moving the arrow more to the right, which is the opposite of what we've been used to with before and after pictures. This is the same location in Fragments of Hope in Belize. So plant a million corals, it's not just a good idea, it's a good start. And it's also something that we can transfer. And with my other colleagues who also showed the books and the publications, this is active coral restoration, just came out with many 550 pages with 72 people putting case studies and all the things you'd need to know about coral restoration that's available today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. Great talk. We are going to move on from Dave to research and development and a talk on Mission Iconic Reefs. Tom Moore from NOAA will be leading that talk. Tom is the Coral Reef Restoration Lead for NOAA and in NOAA's Restoration Center. In this position, he's worked for over 20 years on the cutting edge of tropical marine ecosystem conservation, merging science and policy to address a multitude of global and regional threats. He leads a cross-agency multidisciplinary team working on issues ranging from the role that natural infrastructure can play in mitigating the effects of climate change to the appropriateness of genetic interventions in restoring coral reefs. Tom is also co-chair of the International Coral Reef Restoration Consortium and the convener of Reef Futures, a global coral restoration and invention of science symposium. Sorry about the wordiness there. Go ahead, Tom.
Thanks, Jennifer. And thank you everyone for joining us today to kick off the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration and talk about what we can do with coral reefs. I'm here to talk a little bit today about a restoration effort that we launched in the Florida Keys in the United States about 2 years ago. And just like around the rest of the world, the coral reefs of the Florida Keys are really the backbone of our economy. They're responsible for so many of our jobs, so much of our tourism, and so much of people's livelihoods and the foods that they put on the food they put on their plate, just like they are elsewhere in the world. And unfortunately, just like they are elsewhere in the world, these same reefs the reefs of the Florida Keys have actually served as the icons of decline of the coral reef system. Unfortunately, canary in the coal mine that was not recognized until too late, as we saw a reef system that was thriving in the 70s, still salvageable in the 80s, but unfortunately lost almost to the point of non-repair by the 2000s. And at this same period of time, as we were losing our reef systems in the Florida Keys, we were also trying to get restoration started in earnest. Coral reef restoration has been going on in one form or the other around the world for a couple different decades, but really started to thrive in the Florida Keys about 15 years ago, and since that point has begun to expand more and more globally from there. And even though we got our start in the Florida Keys over 15 years ago, that restoration has just not been keeping up with the declines that we've been seeing. While we've been successful at the local level, the gap that exists between success at the local level and success at the ecosystem level is not just big, it's a massive gap. And so while proud of what we've done, we've always known that we needed to do more. And continuing to lose these reefs was not an acceptable solution. And so we decided to begin to take bigger and bolder action to get at this work. For the longest time, when I or others were asked, what do we need to do to bring these reefs back? The simple answer was we just need to do more. Or how much money do we need? We need more than we have. And frankly, that was not cutting it. That was not something that was resonating for folks in terms of them understanding really the scope of the problem, the scale of the resources. But at the same time, myself and others, we were a little afraid at times to put a dollar value on it, to put a number on what was necessary, because we knew that it was big. But a couple years ago, we said, you know what, we've got to just be honest with ourselves, and we have to be honest with the people that are around us in our communities, and begin to share that we can really turn this system around, but it's going to take a sustained effort. And so we decided that rather than continuing to do good restoration at the local level, to try to do great restoration at the ecosystem level and begin to expand how we did that. And so to do that, we launched an effort called Iconic Reefs. And this started as an effort to identify a series of discrete but extremely meaningful reef sites up and down the Florida Keys that we could focus restoration at. The Florida Keys has, nearly 50 individual reef locations associated with it. And we knew that trying to tackle all of those at once wouldn't make sense. And so what we wanted to do was identify places that were iconic historically in terms of how they serve the reefs. Carey Short Reef in the north, which has been that poster child of iconic decline, all the way down to Eastern Dry Rocks in the south, which is a heavily used and frequented reef by many cruise ship passengers, to many other iconic reefs in between. Reefs that represent different habitat types, some that are remote and some that are very close to population centers. Reefs that have all received some type of restoration, but not extensive restoration to date. And so we brought together a multidisciplinary team that represented both the public and the private sector to really begin to say, what will it take to comprehensively restore these sites? Not just do a little bit of restoration on one spur or take one corner of these sites, but comprehensively turn these sites around from approximately 2% coral cover today to their historic levels of cover and function in a much shorter period of time than what they were lost to do. And so as we launched this effort, we knew we needed to do a couple things. One was, as I was talking about here, begin to identify these locations. But it was also to think differently about how we approach restoration. Most restoration around the world right now is focused on step number 2 here, coral propagation and planting. But we know as we look to our brethren in the terrestrial world of restoration that it is much more broader, and there's many more elements to that. And we knew we needed to incorporate those elements into how we thought about restoration is we were going to do it more comprehensively. A much more dedicated approach to site preparation, not simply clearing the areas where you're going to place your coral, but comprehensively evaluating the site before you do restoration to remove the invasive and the nuisance species, to get that site ready for restoration. Then to do a comprehensive restoration using a variety of different coral species, to supplement that restoration with grazers, in our case, sea urchins and king crabs, to help balance the herbivory in that system that's also been lost over the years. And then a dedicated effort on stewardship and maintenance, not just going back and visiting our reef restoration sites every 6 months to a year for simple monitoring and adaptive management, but comprehensively being at those sites on a regular basis with what I like to refer to as reef rangers, but people that are at these sites, people that know these sites, people that can get ahead of problems before they exist. When we go to a park in our terrestrial systems, people take out the trash each morning from the day before. They pick up the fallen trees. And that's exactly what we want to do with these reef sites that we're investing so many resources in. And then obviously, as important with all restoration, a comprehensive monitoring and adaptive management program. However, to truly put a number on what was necessary to comprehensively restore these sites, we had to understand these sites significantly better than we do today. We needed to dig into each of these sites and understand exactly how much habitat down to every square meter was represented by different types of the reef system, which required more mapping than we even already had, even for this system that we had studied so heavily for so long. Once we had that, we were able to dig deep into each one of those individual habitats and identify restoration targets by habitat type for each one of those systems. Some of those restoration targets were based on historical cover. Others were based on what we felt like we could do today with the species that we could restore, because while certainly our goal is historic cover and historic function, we have to recognize that that cover is unlikely to look the same as it did historically. There's going to be different species in the mix. And while we are actively trying to work with as many different species as we can, the reality is the future is going to look different than the past. But that doesn't mean that future can't still provide many of the same ecological functions that those past reefs did. We also knew we couldn't do this overnight. We'd lost these reefs over the course of 5 decades, and we knew it would take many years to bring them back, even though hopefully not that long. At these 7 reef sites, we had about 2% coral cover today, and our goal was to move slowly to, or hopefully quickly, to 10% coral cover, and then slowly move from that 10% coral cover, which we hope to be able to help us really regain some of the structure and function at these sites, bring back some of the fish to these reefs, stabilize the system, and then begin to balance that out with a number of other slower growing species, and then even further with more slower growing species and more aggressive approaches, getting ourselves to eventually 25% coral cover in 20 years. While certainly not overnight, much better than the 5 decades it took to go from 25% coral cover to 2% coral cover. And so to do this, we knew we needed to comprehensively lay this out, look species by species, look at growth patterns associated with those species, look at mortality patterns associated with those species, and look at the area within each of these areas that we knew we needed to address. How many corals would we put out each year? What we were capable of doing? How would those grow over time? To ultimately look at exactly how many corals we would need to restore each one of these individual segments of each of these reefs. Ultimately, this helped us get to the number of mature corals that would be necessary. These aren't individual outplants per se, but these are the mature colonies that we would ultimately need to achieve, which will obviously in many cases take anywhere from 4 to 25 individual corals to achieve many of these actual mature corals. Look at the number of grazers that were needed and all of these other components. And then ultimately, to do the scary thing for many people, and that's to put a price tag on what it would cost to do this. We knew that we were way below this level of investment and remain way below this level of investment in restoration in the Florida Keys right now. But we knew to gain that additional investment, we needed to put some really solid numbers on this to show that we understood what it would cost. We don't have these resources today. But we are seeing that since we put this plan out about 2 years ago, that we are seeing a much greater level of investment because investors now understand what is necessary to achieve a particular goal at a particular place. And they're much more likely to make that investment in restoration. And so while we don't have all of these resources today, we are well on our way to getting towards having those resources over time, we believe, by beginning to comprehensively lay out a plan. We've now truly moved into operational mode at all 7 of these sites, beginning to identify different portions of them for which one of our partners are going to be restoring each of those sites, where they're going to focus, what restoration techniques are going to be happening. And we're proud to say that that work is really starting to show some meaningful results on the ground. We have a long way to go. We are just about 1 year into the operational element of a 20-year program, but we're excited already with some of the results that we're seeing. As I showed you earlier, Carey Strut Reef, which has been our icon of decline, is now starting to add additional images to that time series, and we're beginning to see that restoration truly can begin to slowly reverse course. It will take time, it will take patience, but over that period of time, we really do believe we can return this asset back to the community. And an important element of what we're doing in Mission Iconic Reefs is not to restore areas that people can't go to and people can't touch. We're not looking to create museums or parks that have closed borders to them. We're looking to return this asset to the community so the community understands the value that that asset provides them, that it can create jobs within that community, and that we can have balanced community use and stewardship of it. So I hope many of you can learn from our lessons that we've learned in our restoration in the Florida Keys. Invite any of you to join us and invite you to continue to learn more about what we've been doing here and the challenges that we've had over the years. And also would encourage any of you here to consider joining us at Reef Futures. Reef Futures is the only global conference that's dedicated to coral reef restoration, and we'll be holding the second Reef Futures in Key Largo, Florida this coming December. And you can learn more about Reef Futures at reeffutures.com. Thank you very much, and look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations today.
Thank you, Tom. That was part of my struggle in introducing you, was trying to remember exactly when Reef Futures was so I could do a plug, but probably best to look on the website. So moving from Florida to Australia and the Great Barrier Reef, we're going to hear a presentation on the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program from Dr. Cedric Robio. Dr. Robio is the Executive Director of the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Research and Development Program, formerly the Director of the Reef Trust Partnership between the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and the Australian Government Reef Trust, and Project Director of eReefs. Cedric has more than 20 years innovation leadership experience in both the private and public sectors, delivering complex multidisciplinary programs in biotechnology, water, and the environment. He holds a PhD in environmental toxicology from the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, and an engineering degree from the Paris School of Physics and Chemistry. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Jennifer. Can you hear me okay? Yep, thank you. So just stepping back a little here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program, which is a partnership between the Australian government and key scientific institutions in Australia that are listed here below on this slide. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm meeting on today, the Turnbull and Jagera people, and all the traditional owners of the Great Barrier Reef that have walked this land and sailed this country and this sea country for millennia. I would like to pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging leaders. I have the benefit of coming after a great set of speakers, and you've covered most of my talk, so that's great. Coral reefs, yes, they're too important to lose. We have a limited window of time to act, and clearly what we're doing here as R&D is not a substitute for dealing with the cause of climate change. And the priority number one for coral reefs is to reduce greenhouse gas emission and achieve carbon neutrality as soon as possible. We are also firmly of the view that it's about maintaining and intensifying the conventional management of the marine park, which includes fisheries management, water quality improvements, and crown-of-thorns starfish control. It's all about building the resilience of these coral reefs. But as has been mentioned before, even if global warming was to be limited to 1.5 degree or even less, the current approaches are not enough to guarantee the future of coral reefs. And so we're focusing on options and interventions that we can make available to buy some time. The Great Barrier Reef is really, really big. That's an opportunity, but that's also a challenge. It's simply too big to replace. So we are not proposing to rebuild the Great Barrier Reefs, but we are focusing on maintaining the resilience of the existing functional ecosystems. As was mentioned today, it's always the most cost beneficial option to maintain the diversity and the richness that is already here. The Great Barrier Reef is a highly variable environment. It's the length of Italy, and it's also a highly connected system. And therefore, interventions, deployment will need to be really strategic and consider a whole range of factors, including the breadth of traditional owners, communities, and industries that rely on the reef. So right now, we're launching into a program which has started earlier this year, which is funded by the Australian government and the science partners. And it's about $120 million, about over 4 years to conduct some fundamental and applied research and engineering. And the idea here is to make available some interventions that are safe, socially acceptable, and economically viable to intervene on the reef at scale across 3 different areas, which again have been discussed today. Protection. We are looking at cooling and shading reefs with a view to limit the risk of bleaching. We're also looking at assisting adaptation to help corals naturally adapt to an increase in temperature. And we also, in some cases, will have to restore areas of the Great Barrier Reef simply because the habitats are too degraded and natural recovery can no longer happen. The Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program is unique in a number of ways. We've had the chance and the benefit of having an extensive feasibility study where we went through a range of options and technologies that could be considered, and we were able to filter through that and design a priority program, which we're now delivering. And we established a consortium with a very, very strong governance framework. We realize it's a high visibility program and issue in Australia and around the world. We have a board, a steering committee, and a managing entity that are helping us deliver this program. It's a public good program. Everything we do, we're trying to make all the data and the intellectual property available. And the idea here is that it's a global issue, so we need global partnerships, and we need to share our discoveries and make that as available as possible. It's an integrated program. We share resources across all these partners. For example, we're coordinating the field work, modeling and decision support, engineering, engagement, and communication. It's also multidimensional. We address issues related to regulation, social license, traditional owner matters, as well as all the science and engineering that you can imagine in a program like that. And it's end-to-end, and that's something that's really important for us, is we're looking at these interventions from the knowledge gaps and the fundamental science all the way through to the engineering, the deployment, and the scale up. And we working as a group to consider all these matters as a whole in a holistic way. And we're seeing all these development as a cycle we're running through. So all the fundamental scientists are working side by side with the engineers and the deployment modelers. So the program, I encourage you to go and have a look on the website at gbrrestoration.org. There is a lot of material, and these sub-programs are described in much more detail. But essentially, what you have here is a series of intervention-focused sub-programs where we're doing the technical and the science development around that, and a number of cross-cutting sub-programs that support that across engagement, regulation, as I mentioned before, but also a very significant program of ecological research to consider the risk and the benefits of intervening on the Great Barrier Reef. And on this website, you can also access all the reports from the feasibility study. So what I thought I would do here is just give you a bit of a flavor of the intervention R&D we're doing. There are, as I mentioned before, about 6 areas: cooling and shading the reef. We are really sensitive, obviously, to bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef. We've had 3 events in over the course of 5 to 6 years, and that's very significant, and the losses were enormous. So preventing bleaching or reducing the impact of bleaching is really important. We have 2 technologies that we're looking at in detail here, fogging and cloud brightening, both reducing UV exposure of corals, as well as, in some cases, cooling the surface. Fogging is what you can expect, just making fog, and it's about how you would deploy that. We know how to make fog. Cloud brightening is about using aerosols from sea water to change the properties of the cloud and reflect more sunlight. In this case, it's both about demonstrating the technology and also proving that it can be deployed at scale. Potentially, this technology, cloud brightening, can be deployed at a scale that is commensurate with the size of the GBR. Rubble stabilization is the space that a lot of people know, which is about stabilizing the substrate so that we can improve recovery. The fact is that on the GBR, we don't really know how significant that is and whether it represents a real opportunities to make a change and positive impact on this ecosystem. So we will assess the magnitude of this issue and also the type of technologies that we would have to deploy to achieve benefit at a scale that is relevant for this ecosystem. And again, that would mean changing the way we do things and look at much more cost-effective binding and stabilization and technologies. Moving corals, that was mentioned a couple of times today. It's about larval, so spawning sleek collection, larval rearing, relocation, and resettlement. That's a program that has been running for a number of years on the Great Barrier Reef. We, in this case, are trying to increase the scale and find new ways to roll this program out, both in terms of larger scale engineering, as well as involving more people through the use of citizen science and some systems that we can deploy rapidly on private boats. We're also looking at how we can use this to translocate corals and benefit from corals that are already adapted to a higher temperature to support areas that are much more sensitive. Coral cryopreservation, mentioned again before, of course, it's about biobanking and securing and preserving the genetic diversity of coral reefs. But for us, it's also through the high throughput technologies, a strategy to actually kickstart aquaculture production lines outside potentially of the cycle of spawning, which is quite limiting in terms of timing and frequency. And that's something that would allow us to consider production in a very different way, where we would be able to kickstart a range of species at different times during the year, depending on the needs of the system. And that's obviously linked to the enhanced corals and aquaculture deployment, which is a very significant area of the program. We have worked for years and we will continue to work on mapping the reef genome and understanding the adaptive capacity of corals under the current conditions as well as predicted conditions. We're also looking at how to enhance that thermal tolerance, and we're looking here at breeding methods as well as treatments to enhance that resilience. When we do that, obviously, with a view to deploying more thermally resistant coral on the Great Barrier Reef, but we need to understand in much more detail and across a range of species the benefits and trade-offs of doing that. In terms of aquaculture, we're really taking a view that is about mass production. So we're looking at this system as a standard production issue, and we're looking at adapting the current techniques that we use in aquaculture to be much more consistent with what we see in the manufacturing space. And we're trying to take every step of the way through a readiness level to allow us to get rid of the bottlenecks in the production and go to much higher numbers. So to give you an idea, we're talking of maybe in the scale of several tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands at the moment, and we would need to increase that for the Great Barrier Reef and to have a significant impact on the ecosystem. We would need to increase that to tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions per year. So we're doing a lot of work in changing the way we go through this process, and David mentioned a fair bit of that in terms of the different steps. It's the same here, but we're trying to use new technologies to accelerate and also I guess, mass manufacture all of these different steps, from the settlement devices all the way to the strategies to deploy these in the field. And here, there on these photos, you have an example of the type of devices that we're trying to build to be able to accelerate the process. So look, that was just an overview of where the program is going. I would really, again, encourage you to go and have a look on our website and contact us. There's so much information there, and we are really looking forward to collaborating with everyone and learning from what's happening in the field, both in Australia and internationally, and also being able to translate our discoveries and our technologies to these same sites. And finally, I'll leave you with this quote, which is really reflecting how everybody feels in the program. We have more than, we're expecting about 250 people involved at some point in the program. And we have a singular focus on trying to make a difference for the Great Barrier Reef. So thank you very much, and enjoy World Ocean Day and World Environment Day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last, but certainly not least, is a presentation from Dr. Aaron Muller from MOTE Marine Laboratory and Aquarium. Dr. Muller's research focuses on coral health and disease dynamics. She applies a comprehensive approach that spans from understanding shifts in microbial assemblages of corals to applying hierarchical spatial and temporal models to understand the drivers causing coral disease outbreaks. Dr. Muller's goal is to determine how coral health and disease change under climate change and ocean acidification conditions. She anticipates that once we understand the mechanisms leading to compromised coral health, we can prevent disease outbreaks in our future, which is so very critical for Florida and the Caribbean right now, given the stony coral tissue loss disease outbreak. Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, ICRI, for providing the opportunity for me to be here today. I'll be introducing MOTE's multifaceted approach to resilient reef restoration to help recover some of Florida's coral reefs. MOTE Marine Laboratory is a completely independent nonprofit research institution located in Sarasota, Florida, and we have over 30 different PhD staff members as well as hundreds of other staff that focus on research related to our oceans. But we have, in addition to our main campus, a satellite campus located in Summerlin Key, Florida, called our Elizabeth Moore International Center for Coral Reef Research and Restoration. And at this innovative hub, we have over 30 staff members that focus on coral reef research, restoration, and ecosystem recovery. This includes 19,000 square feet of enclosed research space and also several different in-water coral nurseries and one of the world's largest land-based coral nursery as well. We invested a lot of people power, a lot of time, and certainly infrastructure and funds to study coral reefs because of how incredibly important they are to our ecosystem services. The Florida Reef Tract is estimated to be worth at least $8 billion to our state economy and helps to provide over 70,000 local jobs. However, as Tom Moore mentioned, that reef has been in an incredible state of decline, starting over 50 years ago, with no signs of natural recovery. Because of that, MOTE scientists began conducting research on coral restoration, focusing initially where most people began, in the water, with in-water coral nurseries. We now have 2 different nurseries offshore that primarily focus on staghorn corals. And within those nurseries, we can have over 20,000 fragments that are growing at any given point in time to help fuel outplanting and reef recovery. Within those nurseries, over the last couple of years, we've integrated a genetic management plan so that we can maintain over 190, close to 200 different genotypes. Genotypic diversity is obviously really important for ecosystem recovery. And I'll talk about how we integrate new sexual recombinants into our genetic management plan at the end of this talk. But it's been a big focus for us in order to increase genetic diversity within our staghorn population so that we can help outplant corals that are more robust and resilient to things like global climate change. At any given year, we can outplant about 25,000 of these staghorn corals. And in general, although this nursery focuses on staghorn corals, we've integrated a hybridization approach where we now also integrate boulder and brain corals as well as elkhorn corals into these in-water nurseries to help increase with efficiency through time. In addition to the in-water nurseries, we implement the microfragmentation and fusion approach that Dr. David Vaughn integrated into restoration several years ago at MOTE. So he gave a nice background on what this process involves, chopping up little corals or larger corals into small sized pieces to help accelerate the growth. And we've documented that this can actually increase growth by 50 times faster compared with larger fragments kept intact. So as you're cutting up the coral, you're actually triggering a growth response, which creates a large amount of tissue that you can use to fuse at outplant sites. Our MOTE land-based coral nursery maintains at least 30,000 of these fragments over time and thousands of different genotypes. These genotypes primarily are coming from sexual recombination from spawning events that have been donated to MOTE through partners like NOAA, the National Park Service, and even the Florida Aquarium, but also within our own efforts that we're integrating into some of our restoration work. At any given year, we're outplanting about 10,000 of these corals to Florida's coral reef. And so you can kind of see how easy it is to integrate large number of outplants onto that reef ecosystem within a generally short period of time. But you don't want those corals to go out into the reef ecosystem and not survive. Over the years, we have honed our practices and integrated resilience through genetic diversity and also integrating things like heat tolerance, which I'll talk about next, into our restoration plan. So as an example, a case study here, Eastern Dry Rocks, which we've outplanting at for the last 3 years, we have over 90% survival of our outplanted corals during that time period and over 700% more living coral within that reef compared to what we actually outplanted. So these corals are not only surviving, but they are thriving when you do it right. In addition to making sure that we are putting those foundational species of corals back onto the reef structure, MOTE scientists and our partners are also integrating research on how other ecosystem factors can recover because of those efforts. Maybe things like the fish biomass or fish community or herbivory is changing through time because of those efforts. And we have started launching some of that research to try to quantify that during our restoration practices. We also can quantify how other services like coastal protection can change from restoration activities by measuring things like accretion rates associated with our restoration activities, as well as changes in rugosity and niche structure that can increase biological diversity within those reef areas. And finally, we can look at how our outplants potentially may be influencing local recruitment into that area by putting out things like settlement tiles and seeing what benthic invertebrates may settle on them, targeting scleractinian corals to see if we can enhance local natural recruitment in addition to our efforts with our staff. Now, I mentioned that we are integrating different types of resilience into our restoration practices, one of them being genetic diversity, but we also screen all of our genotypes for resilience to the 3 major issues facing Florida's coral reef today: disease, which can be species specific, high water temperatures associated with climate change, and ocean acidification, the changing ocean chemistry associated with excess CO2 in our atmosphere. Now, what we try to do is test our different genotypes for resistance to these major issues facing corals. And we can integrate that information in a couple different ways into our restoration practices. Here's an example of 2 different genotypes that have been exposed to the same increased water temperature for months. And you can see the coral on the right has maintained most of its color and has grown significantly larger than the coral on the left, which is largely bleached and very small. And so we can glean what makes each genotype unique, which ones are going to survive the next bleaching event. What about the next disease outbreak? What ones are going to continue to grow even though the pH of our oceans is declining? and we can figure out whether there's particular trade-offs associated with some of those resilient traits. Now, what do we do with that information? Well, we can always outplant those corals that seem to be more resistant to some of those threats, and we have done that quite successfully. Dave Vaughn mentioned this in his talk, and I'll just revisit it. We had a really nice success with spawning in 2020. We showed that one of our outplant sites, which had several different boulder corals that had been outplanted and reskinned over old dead coral heads using the microfragmentation and fusion process, all spawned. 80% of them actually spawned in synchrony after being put through that microfragmentation, outplanting, and fusion process. And these corals also were shown to be resilient. In 2015, they survived massive coral bleaching within the region. They survived Hurricane Irma in 2017, and the site was also hit very hard with stony coral tissue loss disease a couple years ago. Regardless of all of that, those corals still managed to spawn, showing that the methods and the idea behind the microfragmentation and fusion process can produce sexually viable, resilient corals if the research and practices are put into place. In addition to spawning on the reefs, we've actually integrated spawning within our own system. So we can grow corals to reproductive size and have them spawn within our land-based nursery. And here we can actually collect their gametes as they release them and conduct focused sexual reproduction crosses. So as those gametes are released, we know a lot about the parents, which ones are thermally tolerant, which ones are more resistant to disease. And we can actually cross these parents in the lab to create 2 parent crosses of all of our different genotypes that we're interested in researching. At this point, we are doing completely reciprocal crosses. That means we cross susceptible with susceptible corals, resistant with resistant corals, and resistant with susceptible corals, because we still need to understand the trade-offs associated with some of these resistant factors. But this directly integrates into our sexual diversity and genetic diversity that we have within our land-based and in-water coral nurseries. We can actually now in-house settle all of these coral species that we research and grow them to be large enough to integrate directly into the asexual reproduction pipeline. And this can actually occur within just a matter of a few months. So corals that spawned in August of 2020 are now integrated into our asexual fragmentation pipeline now. So it takes about 6 to 8 months only to get them to be large enough to actually start fragmenting them so that you can maintain that genotype in your land-based nursery and also outplant them within a year after they've settled. So I hope you've gotten a little bit of information about what we're doing at MOTE. We are really focused on the entire cycle of coral restoration, integrating things like sexual reproduction in-house and through our partner collaborations, also taking those corals that are large enough to process into our asexual fragmentation pipeline, where we can then grow them out and do the resilience screening to figure out which corals are special and unique and resistant to the different threats facing coral reefs today. We can then outplant them onto the reef or grow them within our nursery so that they are reproductively viable, being parents for the next generation, thus increasing the resistance of the offspring of our outplanted population and increasing genetic diversity simultaneously. And I would like to just thank you all for taking this time, for allowing me to share the information with you, and to thank our different funding sources, recognizing that this is an incredible collaboration between philanthropy, the state of Florida, and also our federal agencies that are providing all of the infrastructure and foundation that we need to continue to do restoration on Florida's coral reef. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. You guys have been a great partner to NOAA for many years. So thank you for everything you're doing down in Florida at the moment. We do have a few minutes for some questions and discussion. I hope that we've given you all a taste of the many restoration efforts going on around the world and the common thread of restoration at scale to restore, recover, and preserve the ecosystem services coral reefs provide to so many people around the world that some of our speakers have touched on. I think you're getting the sense that coral restoration is an emerging and rapidly changing and expanding field with many avenues for additional research and development. One of the things that I noted on as I was listening to different presentations is that many new technologies that range from coral propagation to environmental interventions to prevent bleaching, to gene banking, to understanding corals at that genetic level, to really key in on what those resilient traits are, to and corals' innate adaptive capacity to withstand bleaching events, ocean acidification, and disease. So with that, we had a couple good questions come in over the chat and some pre-developed questions that I wanted to ask folks. The first question is one that we get at NOAA a lot, and we're struggling to figure out how to do meaningfully, is how can citizen science or community science be most useful to these efforts locally and globally? And I'll start with Cedric from an Australian perspective. How are you or how would you engage citizen and community scientists in these efforts? Tom, I think we need to let Cedric unmute himself.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yes, look, we have actually these things happening right now in Australia, because as you've seen today, the local restoration is taking the lead. I mean, the large programs are a few years away from really being able to implement things at the scale they're talking about. So we have in Australia on the GBR at least 2 areas where we have restoration hub, as we call them, where industry and citizen science and local communities, and especially traditional owners, come together to coordinate and work together to integrate some of the science. And Ian spoke to the guidance that has been provided through the guide there. We're helping them translate that into their programs, but we're also agreeing with them what type of protocols they could use for monitoring. And that type of information is feeding back into the research. Our social engagement space and regulatory engagement space is working directly at the local level to understand how communities react to the various types of interventions. So we are actually working hand in hand, but they're a bit ahead of us. And we recognize that. And we think that we are really emphasizing the importance of that, because they will be the vectors for us to start rolling out the interventions that we might develop in the future. So it's working already, but we think the models that we develop might become cookie cutters in Australia. You know, we might replicate that in different sites, but we need to learn from the international community there.
Thank you so much. And Tom Moore, given the large scale of Mission Iconic Reefs, how are we incorporating citizen participation?
Yeah, so I've always viewed citizen participation as something that can happen at so many different levels. We need people to be aware of the situation regardless of where they live, and take actions in their daily lives to both protect the coral reefs as well as protect all of our other ecosystems around the world by making smart choices in terms of how they consume energy. But more directly onto the reef, we've got a number of partners, some of whom are here on the phone today, as well as others that have robust programs for participation in these programs. One of our partners in the Florida Keys, the Coral Restoration Foundation, hosts an event called Coralpalooza, which is actually taking place this coming weekend that folks can sign up for, and that has numerous ways for citizen participation to take place, both virtually and in person, and ways for people to learn how they can begin to engage in these activities around the world. And then for folks that live local to coral reefs, many organizations rely very heavily on robust volunteer networks, people that can become people who are very close to these organizations and learn how to do this work, not just fly in really quick for a weekend, but really people that can become robust participants. But one of the best places to learn about citizen participation is the Coralpalooza event that's taking place this weekend through the Coral Restoration Foundation.
Thank you, Tom. Another great question from the audience is, what are climate smart models and how do we use them to select sites? Liz, maybe you want to provide a little bit of perspective on that?
Sure, I'm happy to. There are a number of different methods proposed for doing restoration site selection. And recently, more and more people are starting to use climate change projection models and also other things that can help pull climate change and resilience information into the decision-making framework for site selection, things like reef resilience assessments or vulnerability assessments. These are things that we've suggested in the manager's guide and have been using with the 4 US Pacific jurisdictions to try to do, but I think this is a really important and critical way forward. There are kind of local level site selection criteria, and then this broader scale site selection criteria. I think that we need to be considering how climate change is going to affect coral reefs in the future, as well as corals that are being restored and the various methods that we're using for restoration, things like substrate stabilization or reef artificial reefs. How will those things also be affected by climate change? So I defer to others as well, but I think that that's a really important path forward for us to be considering sites where climate change might not impact reefs as much, or there are some local level environmental conditions that confer resilience of reefs, and selecting those for restoration.
Thanks. I'll put one more question out to the group, and anyone feel free to jump in on this. According to increasing trends of global warming and increased frequency of coral bleaching, how reliable do you think our various restorations efforts are? And anybody feel free to jump in on that. Tom Moore looks like he's got his hand up.
So I'll just say, I think it's really important to recognize that the work we're doing as part of reef restoration is to help stabilize this system. I don't think anybody working in reef restoration beyond things at the extreme local level believe that coral reef restoration is the solution to ultimately recover reefs from their current states of degradation. We're trying to stabilize the system, to give the system the tools that system will need to recover itself, as hopefully broader efforts to curb carbon emissions and lower the temperature, or at least stabilize the temperature on the planet, take place. If we don't act now to even stabilize the system to help keep corals on the reefs, there won't be any corals there to recover once those broader efforts take place. That's why this goes hand in hand with our efforts to reduce carbon emissions. That is still the critical key to ultimately recovering reefs. Our restoration work that we're doing is really to try to give those reefs a fighting chance to still be there when they have an opportunity to have an environment that is healthy again.
And looks like Dave Vaughn has his hand up.
Yes, thank you. Tom said it perfectly. I would just like to add a few other things. It's not necessarily just for the corals themselves. We have near 30 species of corals here in the Florida Keys, but we literally have hundreds of species of fish that require a living coral reef to be healthy as an ecosystem. And we have hundreds of thousands of invertebrates and microbes that require a living reef to be there. So stabilizing the reef in locations, and also like Iconic Reefs program, stabilize them in areas where most people can see them and understand that there is a problem and they need to work in helping to solve the stressors that are on there, I think is the right way to go.
Thank you. And one last question, and it's a bit of a surprise question. I'm going to ask Frank Mars. I see he's hung in with us for this entire presentation. If you'd like to provide a few remarks and specifically maybe talk about the role of private industry in these types of endeavors.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm actually not going to talk about private industry at this point, because I think probably most of you are aware of the work we've been doing and how we shifted it from just research to actually engaging the consumer with the brand. So you're going to hear more about that this week and going forward. I thought this session was excellent. Everybody had some great stuff. I learned a lot Aaron, I thought your talk was great. You know, Tom, your assessment of the situation was amazing. I was amazed at the cost. Cedric, good to see you again. And Dave's book is outstanding. I just think that we got to do more of this. I think we got to drop the politics. You know, we know what works now. There's a lot of us that have been doing lots of different good things individually, and collectively there's probably half a dozen techniques that really work. And if you do the pre-work and understand the ecosystem, you can plan to recover that ecosystem. And the fish are the key. The work that the Exeter team's been doing on sound and the recovery of sound from an ecosystem perspective is really cool. Tim Gordon in particular. So, you know, in my UN advisory capacity role, I think there's no reason why we can't actually ramp this up. So it'll be interesting to see if we can get more companies involved and more consumers involved through what we're going to try and do with Sheba and TNC and the whole video. So if you haven't watched the video, watch the video, because then Elizabeth will be happier. So
Thank you so much. Great to hear from you. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and we have one last speaker, and that is His Serene Highness Prince Albert II of Monaco. He will provide closing remarks, and just a reminder for folks that over the last few decades, the Principality of Monaco has been a leader in ocean protection at the international level. Since 2018, the Principality of Monaco has been co-chairing the International Coral Reef Initiative along with Australia and Indonesia, and they were great chairs the last few years. And a big gulp on my part, the United States has decided to try to follow in those footsteps. So we'll attempt to do you proud. And the commitment to the oceans from His Serene Highness Prince Albert II of Monaco is also materialized through the many actions of its foundation in favor of the protection of the ocean. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'd like to thank you for the discussions that have been taking place, and to the members of ICRI for their ongoing mobilization. The Principality of Monaco is proud to contribute to this initiative and to shoulder its responsibilities. It is also with pride and pleasure that I welcome the presence at this seminar of one of our eminent scientists, Dr. Margot Hein. By way of conclusion to the various issues discussed today, I would like to mention briefly the most important dates for our future action. There is an urgent need to take action and an opportunity represented by the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, for which I welcome the launch, as well as the other international meetings which lie ahead. I know that we are all convinced here of the importance of coral reefs for the future of our shorelines, oceans, and planet. I also know how important it is for this concern to be shared as widely as possible by politicians and economic players, but also more broadly within public opinion. However, it is clear that work still needs to be done in this respect. Although our contemporaries are becoming increasingly aware of the plight of corals, initiatives aimed at protecting them or restoring their damaged ecosystems are still far from adequate. There are undoubtedly various reasons for this. For example, I believe that the severity and magnitude of the threat faced by corals, a threat which concerns all coral reefs worldwide, may appear as obstacles to efficiency and rapid action and may therefore discourage goodwill. That is why it is important to show, as you have done today, that solutions are now available, that they work, and that they could be rolled out extensively tomorrow. But it is also important, and this is the purpose of your discussions, to observe, understand, assess, and compare these solutions in order to gain a better understanding of the factors and conditions of their success and how to replicate them. This is especially the case at a time when we are seeing opportunities emerge on the international agenda. I'm thinking, of course, of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which I just mentioned. But I'm also thinking of the meetings we have lined up this year, from COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity to the UICN World Conservation Congress. I also refer to COP26, the Climate Change Conference, which should hopefully focus on the role of the oceans and of marine ecosystems in mitigating the effects of climate change. For all these reasons, it is now vital if we are to have a body of solutions ready to be implemented. It is even more important that we are able to develop them without delay, because the situation of corals calls for an urgent response. Let me thank you for your participation in these important discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We're a little bit over, so I thank everyone for hanging in there. And stay tuned for the release of the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network report soon. Think about attending Reef Futures in Florida in December and all of the different activities that His Serene Highness just mentioned. And thank you so much, all the speakers, for great presentations, staying on time. And my sincere thanks to Tom and Francis for organizing this event and making my role quite easy in the process. I bid you a good day and keep up the good fight with restoration.